welcome to Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your pew, 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 pew host, Madeline.
I'm your host, Emma.
And thank you for tuning in to this week's episode. Tuning in or turning in
Yeah, I was
to this
gonna
week's
say,
episode.
turning
You
in.
have become this week's episode. It is you.
You're tucking into bed at noon on Sunday with your episode of Talk This. Turning in.
And it's Emma's side quest. So, Emma, what are we talking about this fine Sunday at noon?
Well, I have to give a shout out to CBB himself, because I did message Madelyn in the middle of the week to say I can't think of anything. My brain is fried. I'm gonna have to figure out a way to fix that because I have a feeling it's gonna be like that for at least like 4 years or so. So enjoy. And one of the ones that he suggested was sound effects and foley in games, and I thought that sounds cool. And so I took it and I stole it.
Thanks, CBB.
Thanks, CBB. I did think of a few things of sound related to be like my inspirations, as you say.
Fake inspirations.
I can't remember. I feel like we've talked about on the show before, like the expectation for like swords to make sounds, even when they shouldn't make sounds. But I can't remember the context of it.
I similarly feel like that is a familiar conversation that we've had, but I could not tell you in what context, which is fine. But yeah, we do expect swords to make noises. And obviously swords in real life make some noises.
Yes, just different
but
noises.
Not
less
like in
noises.
games. Yeah.
I feel like I mentioned during like the last 6 weeks, or maybe just to you possibly, but when I was playing Tales of Symphonia, there were a few sound effects where I was like, that's a Kingdom Hearts sound effect.
Yeah.
They took that from an audio library. The little teleporting noise or whatever is like very much the same. The Cheshire Cat and the Wonder Chef have the same like appearing, disappearing noise, I'm certain. And also not to like spoil the dramatic reveal that'll be in 2 weeks, but I started playing Trails into Reverie, and it's so loud. I have turned the in-game audio down, all of it, to like 3 notches. It's like default set at like 8 or 9 notches. And it's still so loud. Like, I don't understand how it's so loud.
Now, listeners, you do need a little bit of context here, which is that Emma has baby gamer ears.
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah.
So it's fair for her to say, oh, it's so loud, it's so loud. But Emma plays games on like 8 on the TV.
But usually I don't have to turn down the in-game audio. Like, we'll talk about this. Usually, because of my baby gaming ears, I guess, I need to either turn up voices or turn down the music and sound effects to make any dialogue, if the game has dialogue, like, understandable to me. I've never had to turn down voices. I'll just put it like that. Before this,
fair.
I've never had to turn down voices in the audio menu because they're like at the tippy top of right before peaking their mic, basically, is like how loud it is.
Well, I mean, obviously I don't have inspiration for this episode, but it's a hot topic. I just feel like in general in the world to rag on on TV and movie sound design right now. The fact that, I mean, maybe we're all just losing our hearing from our AirPods, right? That's also possible. But none of us can understand anything on TV anymore or in movies because the sound mixing is not done to make that happen.
Yeah, I've read a little bit about like a lot of sound mixing is done like expecting high-end audio equipment now.
Yeah.
So if you're just watching it at home with your normal speakers and you don't have like a movie theater setup or whatever, it's like not sounding right? Because it's not mixed for that. And also just general, like, moves towards naturalistic delivery, versus, like, more theatrical delivery in film as well. Makes it hard to understand what people are saying.
Yeah, they aren't being given audio tracks that are easy to work with to begin with.
Yeah. It did make me reflect, like, I cannot imagine a movie, like, in its Blu-ray, like, giving you options for turning up, like, the voice his audio track and the turning down the music audio track. I don't think that's a thing, but it's so standardized in games. I didn't look too far into this, but I'm really curious how that became like a thing, you know?
I have no idea. There's so many I have no idea. Sound design in games seems to be the Wild West. I mean, there's a lot of really detailed and interesting blogs and articles and interviews and whatever, and all of them seem to come down to like, hey, we're just like out here doing this.
Yeah. In general though, just like in terms of like audio implementation, this is like a whole other like topic you could do, but like, you know, film and TV have their own like accessibility features. Like games haven't consistently managed to figure out how to do like audio description yet.
Because they're not like legally required to.
Yes, and it's probably a time, not for cutscenes. Probably they could probably do it for cutscenes with enough budget, but it'd be difficult for gameplay itself to try to do audio descriptions.
I mean, I guess what I'll say in thinking about that, right, is though theoretically and mechanically, it feels like your middleware thing could include, like in the same way as whenever you're putting an image into a website, right? You have the option to add your alt text.
Yes.
Right? It does feel like I could understand a system where you could more or less add alt text to a sound, right? Potentially. However, the problem being, of course, that at any given time in a game, you might be hearing like 7 sounds.
Yes.
It does, like, that's the challenge. Of how do you create a coherent audio description where it's not just like constantly bombarding you with there's this sound and there's this sound and there's this sound and there's this sound and there's this guy talking but you cut him off because you left and it's just chaotic.
But games might have like accessibility features that movies would not implement. Like I think about a lot of games have now like a high pitch noise filter that you can turn on and off for when there's like, you know, some people are very bothered or repulsed by like particular high pitch noise sounds. So
young people, the olds can't hear them.
Maybe, I don't know.
Just
or
kidding.
Like yeah, but so a lot of things will have like a gate, like you can turn like a gate on, essentially. Which like again, it's just not a thing that you would do in a movie. I feel like.
I mean,
I think it's good. I just think it's interesting to think about like how many accessibility features games have that movies do not implement in the same way.
Well, it comes down to, and you found like really interesting, if you are interested in reading more about sound design or audio implementation in games, the blog at Audio Kinetic is awesome. Just like so much regular content talking about specific games, talking about processes. It was cool. But you found a blog that was about them specifically talking about the difference between working on video game sound and film sound. And just like the whole time, I mean, it really underlines something that comes up in all articles about this, which is that nobody thinks about sound design at all like as a player, right? You as a player don't think, oh God, somebody had to do something to create that door sound.
Yeah.
Or if you do, you think, I guess they recorded a door.
You think, oh, they put the Wilhelm scream in there. I heard it.
Yeah. And like most of the time, and obviously we'll talk about Foley, although much of Foley is not literally the thing either. But you don't think about what has to go into the creation of these sounds. And for the most part, you don't really think about the sounds and what they're doing to you unless they are bad.
Yeah.
So it was interesting to like read, like there are all of these things that are quite different about how you make and how you deliver and how you work on sound for games and for movies, that just like, would that ever have crossed my mind? They seem kind of obvious once you read about them, but having not thought about them, I was like, oh, that's weird and cool.
Yeah, it seems to be like the process of making sounds is not that different depending on what
Right.
you're working on, in that, like, if you're making footsteps, you probably have various ways to make footsteps and like record that, right? And so you might be like stepping in the same heels or whacking the same sneakers or
Right.
whatever.
Using the same synth. Yeah.
But the actual process for how those sounds, like the order of which you might make those sounds and send them along, or the process by which those sounds are then added to the product, right? That sort of thing is a bit more different depending on whether you're working on movies or games. A lot of it seemed to be, in games, it's much more common for the person making the sounds to also be the person like putting the sounds in the game or somewhat responsible for that process. Whereas for movies, that tends to be different roles, is sort of what it sounded like to me.
Yeah, definitely. The guy who's creating the footstep sounds isn't the guy who's mixing it into the final track in the movie. The existence of a final track is itself also something that is so obvious, of course, but you don't think about it.
Yeah.
Right? In terms of literally the files being delivered in games, you just have to send your giant zip file, I guess, of like, here are 7 different door creaking sounds, and here are like 100 different footsteps on different types of pavement and at different speeds and whatever. And here's like 1,000,000 grunts. And obviously, and that for the game purposes needs to be delivered as like a bajillion different files, because of course they're going to be implemented in ways that are not predictable necessarily, as opposed to in movies, like, duh, a movie is a fixed thing. And so in the end, like, ultimately what you're delivering is like, here is a very, very high def, like, one file. Play it with the movie, please.
Yes, exactly. Games also, apparently, according to this article and some other ones, and especially for like indie companies where you're small to begin with, but games tend to bring like an audio engineer on to a project a lot earlier than a movie will. And so they therefore spend longer on the project as well, which I thought was an interesting point.
Yeah, it's always interesting to hear anyone describe games as like, oh, I've got so much time.
Yeah. You might still be busy, but like you're spending more time with the project than you necessarily would with a film.
Of course, also in film, in a way that you simply cannot be in games, you are dealing with the mixture of live sound on set versus Foley or additional sound effects. And so it sounded like that was something that is really challenging, and that in games you don't deal with, or you only deal with to the extent of there are some people who have recorded lines in a studio.
Right, yeah.
And obviously I don't think we should get like so into, we're not really getting so into soundtracks.
Right. We did a episode on music before.
Yeah. But of course, I mean, it goes without saying that game music and game soundtracks have to operate a little bit differently than a film score.
Yes, that as well. It's a lot of game tracks, at least for like action games, probably do function on the same system that sound effects do sometimes. In that, like, certain things will be called by certain events happening in the game.
We love a good system. A sound system, if you will.
Yes. It tends to be, if we're really getting really into it, you're either using WYs, which is how I'm choosing to pronounce it. I didn't actually hear anyone say it out loud, but I do want to call it WYs, you're right. And Fmod. which I do see Fmod in front of games sometimes, because they actually have like a free version that indie projects can use, whereas WYs is a little bit more high end, seems to be. But they're basically just systems that you plug onto your game engine that makes like the implementation of sound effects a little less code intensive, so that your audio engineer can put sounds in your game without having to learn code, as much code as they might need to otherwise.
Yeah, the purpose of these systems really do seem like a nod to the guy who's doing this is not your coder.
Yes.
And he also might want to make little adjustments.
Yes, it's the same reason like there's like for narrative systems, there's like Twine or Yarn or whatever that you might attach to your game engine so that your writer can write things without learning to code. Just a tool that makes it a little simpler to work with, essentially.
Anything to avoid having to learn to code.
There's still a little bit of understanding code involved. It's just like you don't have to write the actual system yourself.
Anything to avoid understanding code.
Because one of the other audio, what's the blog? Audio Kinetic blogs you shared on the Alan Wake 2 one, they used WYs. And one of the things they went through in that blog was like the breathing. So I think another difference, I think you probably think a lot more about breathing when working on games than you do when working on movies. But in Alan Wake 2, the characters, your player characters, do constantly breathe and have sound effects playing when they're breathing, based on, voice lines that the two actors did. Usually you can't really hear it if you're just sort of standing around. They played a clip. They have a clip in there with like the breathing sounds really boosted so you can actually hear it. But the way that the breathing system works is partially because they've given the characters heart rate things. So as the characters' like heart rate values go up based on their like exertion or stuff that's happening, like the breathing sound effect is like called quicker, or different ones start getting called. And once they get like louder, you can actually start hearing them. They also made a point that Alan starts to breathe louder faster than Saga does because he is not as much in shape as she is. Which, like, yeah, good. Thank you for that little detail.
So much of sound design is that, though. So much of the how do you become a sound designer or how do you design a sound is think really carefully about what's happening here.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
It's all so creative. Anytime I read about it with Foley, too, I'm like, oh man, this would be a cool freaking job.
I took a Foley class in college.
So it could be Emma.
Yeah, I wasn't great at it. I was a little too... You really have to be into sound to be a Foley artist, I feel like. And also just not... In college, I was a little embarrassed to walk around with a microphone and just, like, record things, I think is the meat of it. I don't know if I would be as... I feel like I've gained some confidence, as I've gotten older. But that's another part of being a Foley artist, is you do just have to carry your mic around and, like, be like, that's a good sound.
Multiple guys in multiple articles said this. They were like, get a mic you can carry around and, like, collect those sounds.
Yeah, you, like, build your own library, yeah.
That is a crazy thing that you have to do, by the way. That's true of sound design in, like, any industry. I know theater designers who have this stuff. Although theater sound design is, like, 85%. Make the mic sound good, please. So maybe not quite as creative as this all the time. But yeah, it's, like, crazy that you have to assemble, like, a toolkit of sound. It makes total sense.
Yeah.
It's just a wild thing to imagine being a job.
It reminds me of, like, some artists, like, make their own brushes like
Yeah.
digital brushes
Yeah.
that they can use for certain things, or like certain patterns and stuff, which is always very cool to me. And it feels like this is sort of a similar thing, right? Like it's something you got and made yourself, but by saving it and like turning it into a process, you can then actually make your work go smoother.
But also you have to be like a little like wizard weirdo all the time.
Oh, I watched there was a video with I don't actually know if she was Sony Santa Monica employed or just sort of Sony employed, actually. I forget. But with the Foley designer for God of War Ragnarok, which Sony Studios apparently has like a Foley studio that you can go in that has just like random boxes of junk in there, essentially. Junk and not so junk, and specialized objects that have been made for the purposes of recording. But yeah, they just sort of like walked around and like watched her like handle things. Foley is mostly a lot of like jiggling things and like banging on things.
This is probably a good time for those of you who are maybe not quite as immersed in the world of sound design and fun sound design to explain that Foley
Oh yes,
is
good.
the art of creating sounds for some kind of media or performance or whatever, like using real objects. So a fair bit of sound design now takes place in people's, little computers, right? Where they are building various sounds, or they are pulling sounds from pre-existing sound libraries, whether that's like literally the things they've been capturing as they walk around with their microphone, or from, in the same way as you can pull assets for anything in a game, like plenty of sound libraries out there.
Yes.
But Foley is when you are like literally, you got a mic in front of you and you're like, all right, let's do some squelching in the mud.
Yeah.
Kind of stuff.
A lot of squelching flash in video games. So there's a lot of fruits being squished.
I imagine this is another reason why sound design might not be. I not only do you have to love sound,
you also have to love touching things.
Sorry, that wasn't where I was going with that, but that too, perhaps.
Yeah.
Sound and also sensation.
Yeah.
But I was gonna say you probably have to think a lot about what it sounds like for a bone to break.
Yes, she was using the not ziti, the big pasta.
Fettuccine.
No, like that has like a hole in it.
Big rigatoni.
Rigatoni maybe, or manicotti. It was something like that.
Oh, if it was huge, it was manicotti. But
yeah,
okay,
it was,
sure.
like, really big.
Big holy pasta.
Yeah, and she would like put it inside of like a bag and then like just crunch it for bone crunching sounds. In case you were wondering.
And of course, what's even trickier, right, is that there are many sounds that from media that we are used to not sounding like they actually sound.
Yes.
I read a lot about how, a real gunshot doesn't sound like that.
Yes.
But if you put a real gunshot sound into the game, people will be like, that's not what a gun sounds like.
Yes, exactly. It's the same issue with swords, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Or like you said on one of them, like footsteps are much louder than would normally be the case in most situations. Which, yeah, true.
I did want to say, I'm sure in movies you think about breathing, but probably from the perspective of like, crap. Like, Daniel Craig is breathing so loud in this. Like, we gotta fix that. Why is he breathing like that?
Daniel Craig has a cold. We gotta fix that.
God, those sniffles.
Yeah, it's just like I guess it's mostly like you don't have to feed in the breathing.
No, it's there, hopefully.
It's there already, you'd hope. And with something like animation, you're probably not adding like too many just like breathing sounds unless like it's for a purpose, right?
Yeah.
So even that where like there's not breathing and you have to add the breathing probably, it's probably because they're breathing for some purpose, not just because they're breathing.
Yeah, you're doing it as a very specific sound effect, not like as a, oh, like the camera's like sitting on this character's shoulder, so we should probably hear him breathe.
Yeah, exactly.
So I want to talk a little bit about here, like all the things that go into sound design in games and all the things it's doing. Because again, like we said, like I'll say like a million more times in my usual Madelyn side quest mode of like, ooh, amazing that any of this ever gets done.
I'm just always amazed by people doing things, you know?
Right? It's crazy that people do things.
Yeah.
And are out there doing things. Who are they and how? But yeah, when you really dig into it, in many ways, I wish that we could abandon our focus on realistic graphics and start thinking a little bit more about sound, baby.
Yeah.
That article on Hellblade 2, I was like, oh, heck yeah, let's talk about sound coming from different places. Let's talk about advances in sound technology. How about we focus there for a little bit?
Yeah, the Hellblade games are kind of interesting in the... they're more like AA games, but in that sort of realistic space of like audio was like a real like marketing point and selling point for the games in a way that like it usually isn't. Right? I feel like a lot of times audio is mentioned on like a list of various things, right? Like cool audio, is like one point that they go through.
It's weird too, because that's the kind of thing that like film buffs love, right? Or like music people, right? Music people are like, I want total audio fidelity.
Yeah. Well, I feel like in terms of like the composer will get mentioned more prominently a lot of the time than like just audio in general.
Well, of course, but I just mean in terms of pure, like the audio quality is something we care about when we're talking about Apple Music versus Spotify.
Yeah.
Right? As opposed to like, can you imagine like reading a game press release and being like, ooh, yeah, 5.1 surround sound.
I do feel like, okay, the other point where I feel like this came up was like game trailers that like are forced to be like the power of the PS5 always have like the 5 point whatever audio, right? Surround sound. Like there's a Final Fantasy VII Rebirth one that's like, here's the power of the PS5, right? Where you're using the adaptive triggers. There's the sound, right? Like that's one of their like selling points for like the console. But it's not really like a game thing most of the time, I feel like, except for the 2 Hellblade games, which are very like, yes, you have to play these games with headphones on, and like 2, like it's the sound like moves around you, right? So it is interesting that nobody's really like, that's just their thing. That's just Ninja Theory's thing now, is sound.
Yeah, there's room for other studios to decide they're the sound house.
Yeah.
Like there's a space here. But in many ways, like the reason I bring that up is because that I actually think that sound, having done a lot of research for this podcast, I've come away from it now being like, oh, sound is actually way more important. Like sound is almost more important than anything else. If for immersion, for like the player staying connected with the game, even in like a non-immersed way. Because I feel like you can get away with stuff visually that's sort of like a little bit off sometimes. I mean, maybe less so these days. We can't have a low poly tree. But like you can get away with that. But if a sound is like not right, you're gonna have an immediate reaction to that.
I mean, I do feel like I see people like talk about like the gun feel, right? And I feel like in shooting games, which I don't play that much, although I cannot speak to any particular gun feel, honestly. But I feel like mostly what they mean when they say that is like the sound that it makes, rather than
right. You're not literally holding it.
Yes, rather than like the animation or whatever. Yeah. I do think one of the you put in like the GDC list of talks on like sound design, and the top one there was like actually on haptic feedback, but from a sound designer, which didn't get me thinking like that's an interesting crossover, right? Who does do? What's the role that deals with the haptic feedback? On haptic like on a AAA game that has to use the power of the PS5.
Haptic dude.
Like, it does feel like it has to cross over a lot with the sound designer.
Right. I mean, because they're, in some ways, they are doing the same thing. It's just that we have very little in the way of like tactile feedback that we can give in games as it stands right now, as opposed to, obviously, we have like a bajillion things we can do with audio.
Unless you're using the power of the PS5, Madeline. You haven't played Astrobot yet. You don't get it. You haven't felt the little guys rolling around in your controller.
I'm sorry. What I'm trying to say, I'm not trying to denigrate the power of the PS5 or the many interesting things we can do with haptic feedback. However, our only tactile option at this point is vibration.
Yes, yeah.
Which we've kind of done. And haptic feedback.
Yes, the adaptive triggers, too.
I think of that as haptic feedback.
Sure, whatever.
That's in the general haptics world.
Got it.
For me. But, in similar ways, yeah, it is weird, right? Like, to think like, oh, touch is the same as sound. But the sound of vibration is sometimes just as important.
I think haptics is so interesting because it's so much more abstracted, but also immersive at the same time.
Yeah.
Right? It's interesting, right? But I think it's the pairing it with sound that makes that work, right? When your controller rumbles, it's because something's rumbling in the game, audio-wise as well.
True. But it was interesting for me to have pointed out to me, there's a YouTube video from, it's Marshall... no, it wasn't. There's another YouTuber who does a lot of like sound design, but this was actually a video from Riot Games, their YouTube channel. They were talking specifically about like with their sound designers about all of the different roles that sounds in video games play. And so if you think about like movies, right, you might say, okay, like there's the sound that is happening in the movie, right, and there's the soundtrack, right?
Yes.
There's the like underscoring. And so of course we understand that sound is playing a role of telling us here's what's happening, here's what someone is saying. And also it's playing this like emotional underpinning role of we're using some music to tell you how you should feel emotionally. But it was interesting for me to be reminded of all of the work that sound is doing to support the mechanics of games in ways that if you took that away, if you like said, we're not going to use sound at all, and this is all going to have to come up for you like just visually, would either result in so much clutter or just like much less clear reinforced signals.
Yes.
Right? How much do we think about the little chime or ping or crunch we get when someone's ability is ready? How much do we think about the Kingdom Hearts siren or the Pokemon siren when your health is running low?
Right, yeah.
Right, maybe that's really annoying. Or the audio cues that we get that tell us, oh crap, I've been spotted.
Yeah.
Things that, I mean, like that last one made me think a lot about my navigation side quest. Obviously those are two slightly different things, but I was thinking about how bad I am at being a visual person, playing a character in the game, right? There are a lot more visual cues and like ability to notice if someone has spotted you, perhaps in real life, than you can always do with your like, I'm a character on a tank who can't turn my neck.
Yes, exactly.
Game. And audio does a lot to help you, convey that level of situational awareness, that proprioception that is just like not really possible to have with how like a first person game experience works. Or like also to indicate to you like, okay, you did something. Was that a good thing or a bad thing that you just did? Right. Like, was falling off the cliff good or was it bad?
Who can say?
Who can say? The sound designers, in fact, can say. But it was interesting to hear them too about how challenging, and you can just think about this, right? Imagine somebody puts a video of something in front of you with the sound, and the sound isn't quite right. You're like, oh, okay, this is a video for XYZ thing in this job that I'm doing, and there's something about the like underscoring of it or the sound that you don't like. How would you describe what you want? Very hard.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of just mouth sounds.
Yeah.
Because we're very good at talking about visual stuff, I feel like, with descriptive language. Or we can be very good at it if that's our job, right? But I feel like the kind of descriptive language you can use for sound is not always quite so precise. There's so much that goes into even just any given sound effect. Any of these tutorials are like, here's 7 layers to build this dinosaur cry, right? And it can be really hard to say, I actually need you to up the reverb on level 3 instead of saying, can it be more like, "Ah!"
Yeah, exactly. You have to have some like expertise in it, right? I mean, you do with visuals a little bit too to actually describe what needs to be done technically, but you're right that it's like we have more words for it, I guess.
Yeah. But we're better at using those words or at picking out what those words mean.
Yeah.
I can, and I do have to do this at work. I can sometimes, I'm actually not great at this, but I can look at like a logo design or an art design and say, well, like maybe the colors are a little bit too bright. Like this font is giving this vibe, but I'd rather it give this vibe. Right. And with sound, you can do some of that, but it can also, we just like don't. We just don't think of sound. Like you might be able to describe, I'd rather it be sadder. But it's hard to think about what makes a sound sad.
Yeah. In this, the Sony, or it was Wired's, like interview with this, Foley artist for the God of War thing, they had her do like, they showed her like a clip of a lady walking with baguettes under her arm and had her like score it based on whether it was a rom-com or a like thriller movie. And like the sounds that she made for like the walking and the baguettes were like not that different, but like you can feel the difference like when they play them back to back, right? Like the action movie ones are just a little bit stronger and like more intense. I'm having to describe sound now, and we just talked about how we're all bad at that. But like watching her do it, like the things that she did, the things that she used wasn't that different. There was just like a difference in intensity and kind of tone to it that clearly made the genre distinction, even like without like the color grading or whatever that they added to it, which was just an interesting way to display like the ways that subtleties and the recording of sound can make you feel different ways.
I think it's also important to remember that perhaps even more so than visual design, the ability to have this kind of conversation where you're like, yeah, I'm going to have 14 layers to my sound and we're going to be hearing like 7 sound effects at once and using all these resources to do that is like basically newer than almost anything in games. All these games, these old games we talk about where we're like, they had to move everything around to record one line of dialogue.
Right, yeah.
And fit that on the cartridge.
Yeah, a lot of MIDI sounds in the olden days.
A lot of MIDI sounds.
Yeah.
So sound design is something that gets awards at the various game shows.
Yeah.
But in much the same way, I feel like this is the same at the Oscars or whatever. It's like, oh, this game had some sound. Like this sure was a game that was soundy.
Yeah, I grabbed the DICE list and the Game Awards list. Obviously, there's more awards than just those ones out there. But I thought those would be good like ones to look at just to see them. And yeah, there's a lot of like, I don't know if it's like this at the Oscars too. I feel like it is. Like war films get a lot of like audio design awards because they're dealing with so much like gunfire, I guess. And I feel like it's
the sound of guns.
It's similar for a lot of like the awards here is like, oh, you got your Call of Duties, you got your Helldivers, you've got your whatever, right? That's like dealing with a lot of different sort of gunfire and explosions, and that's impressive, right? In its way of like balancing all of that. But it does tend to be like biased towards that a little bit. And also Hellblade.
Yeah. It's pretty much either this is a big blockbuster kind of war game with a lot of sounds, a lot of war sounds, or it's this is a game that has made a big deal about its sound. So Hellblade is kind of in a category of its own there, I think, because it has made a big deal about its sound in like a technological way.
Mm-hmm.
But like then you've got the Parappa the Rappas and the Hi-Fi Rushes of the world where the voters were like, "Oh, that's a game.
That has
That's a
sound in
game
it.
where I've heard about the sound."
That's a game that's got some sound.
And look, I can't pretend that if I were a Game Awards voter, whatever that means, I can't pretend that I would bring any further expertise to the table, which just further underlines this whole thing of like, we actually don't notice sound unless it's big and flashy. And you could certainly, I'm sure I could read interesting articles about, well, there's all sorts of articles, right, about unpacking. Right? Which you can go back and listen to this episode. Em and I both played it. We talked about it on the show at some point in the past couple of years, right? But it's this like 8-bit kind of style game. It's all about like packing and unpacking homes.
Yes.
Right?
Moving house.
Exactly. And sort of like the kind of unexpected thing about it is even though it's this kind of 8-bit style, and so you expect that sound quality, they have 14,000 realistic audio files for all the things that you're moving.
Yeah. I thought it was they did say, I can't remember which article it was, but they like identified like hero sounds that were like, this has to sound exactly like the thing. And then there were others that were like, this doesn't have to sound exactly like the thing, it just has to be believable.
Some libraries like medium ceramic they talked about in one, and they're like, we use that sound for a lot of things, and then we would add something on top of it to help.
Yeah.
And then there were other things that were like, no, it's got to be teddy bear or whatever.
Yeah. But they even have like, they talked about like a bottle that you can move it back and forth if you're not playing with the simplified controls, and it'll like slosh inside of it. I'm just like, sure. Why not, man?
Now, I will say that game I was bringing it up as an example of a game where there's really complex sort of sound design stuff going on, but in many ways it's quite understated.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the fact that they then went out and did a bunch of interviews about it moved it more into the category of like, look at us, there's sound.
Right.
Which I don't say in any like, wow, the work that went into this, crazy. I don't say that in a like mocking way, but apart from those interviews, this could be the kind of game where you'd say, oh, like there's crazy work that went into this, but it's so subtle that it might not be the kind of thing that gets recognized over the Call of Duty sound. Except then they went out and they talked about it a lot and made it into kind of a weird Hi-Fi Rush situation, even though not the same kind of game at all.
I do feel like, you know, I don't know how some of the other awards are run, but the Game Awards currently is just press mostly sends in like a cumulative ballot of some sort. So either like they assign it to one guy in the newsroom, or they actually like take a vote on their stuff and then send it in. Is my understanding of how it currently works. I think at the Oscars it's supposed to theoretically be people who work in the field.
Yeah, you have to be members of the Academy.
Yeah. But is it just everyone in the Academy can vote on everything, or are there like...
That's my understanding.
Okay.
So yeah, it's not like the sound designers are all voting on...
Because it kind of feels like that's how it should be. The Game Awards does have a special voting block for like the accessibility award that they give out, and their esports awards, funnily enough. I guess because they assume most people just don't know enough about esports, so they have their special...
Well, they'll just vote for the name that they've heard of before.
They have their special esports panel as well. But they don't have like specialists voting on like audio design or whatever, which that tends to be my favorite sort of lists. I like reading like lists of like people in specialized fields talking about like their favorite stuff of the year, you know, like those are the more interesting end of the year lists to me. But yeah, I feel like, you know, like audio design, game direction as well is another one where it's just like people don't know what that is.
No.
right?
But that's even true. You could even say some of that is true in movies,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
Like,
Yeah.
that's not always, well, and
Well, like
in any awards show, right?
hair
We
and
like the
makeup.
drama, we like the big.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
hair and makeup, I feel like is a good example for the Oscars again of like it's always like the big period piece, right? Which sort of undervalues some of the more modern costume design work that might be going on because it's not as immediately like, oh, they made those dresses, right, or whatever.
Yeah, those are clothes. There are clothes in this
there
movie.
are clothes in this movie, yeah.
Researching this really did give me a respect for how much spreadsheet work has to go into game sound design.
Oh, yeah.
Uh,
I mean, games are mostly spreadsheets, I feel like I should say.
Yeah.
If you really break a game down into its essential essence, it's just a really big spreadsheet of stuff. But yeah, because there's so many sounds, you better hope your data organization management is up to snuff.
In one of these articles about unpacking, I think the Games Industry Biz one, it talked about how one of the developers her job used to be managing the play-by-play commentary at EA Sports, which sounds like you wouldn't think about it, right? When you're playing it, you don't think about it. You just think about them saying, "Oh, what a goal!"
Yeah.
like.
But yeah, it has to trigger.
It has to trigger, like, think about the experience of a commentary piece triggering incorrectly.
Yeah.
Right? You'd be like, what the heck was that?
Yeah.
You'd be totally distracted. You'd be like, that had nothing to do with what just happened.
Yeah.
And the idea of having to track, especially given that there's commentary now, like, I'm still thinking of this in the context of, like, FIFA 2006, right? But there's commentary now that's like, there's the player's name in there. And the idea of the tracking of that, and not even just the, like, where do I even find all of these files of it, but how do I teach the game to deploy them correctly and in a way that sounds like a human being is saying them, is horrifying.
QA, a very essential part of audio design, as it is everything else in games.
In this same article, they talked with a few different, like, Foley artists, sound designer articles in this article. Another nightmare sounds like a car game.
Yeah, I thought, this is the 2022 article by Alan Wen, I think. But they talked to Fraser Strachan, who worked on Forza Horizon 5, I think. And just talking about, like, there are some cars that have, like, the same engine manufacturer, even though they're manufactured by different companies, right? So it's interesting to think about, like, recording it based on the same engine, but also there's some with, like, rare engines that might have to find, right? So maybe you have to find just, like, an equivalent of some sort that shares that engine manufacturer. But they said, like, the engine and exhaust noise, they feel like need to be really authentic, but stuff of, like, the chassis sounds and the tires are often actually very exaggerated versus how they would actually sound, right? So it's thinking about, like, what do you actually, like, remember and what is, like, enhanced in your head, right? If you're really into cars, like, probably what you're thinking of is, like, the sound that it makes as it revs up, not necessarily, like, the specific way squealing tires sound,
But this is why I think this is such a precise nightmare, because you have a good chunk of the audience for a Forza game is people who are, like, car nuts.
Yeah.
And they want to hear the car. And it's one thing to have to be like, okay, I have to capture the audio of this Honda Civic as, like, accurately as possible. But it's another thing to be like, not only, like, I have to capture it really accurately, but, like, not actually, though.
Yeah.
That feels like such a crazy line to have to walk, especially for a game that has, like, hundreds of cars.
I mean, just for resource gathering, like, getting the cars that you need. You know, you can see the nightmare there already.
Do you think that those people enjoy talking about their jobs at cocktail parties? Like, if you're one of the guys who goes around and records the real life car sounds for Forza, do you think he likes saying that at like his wife's office happy hour?
I don't know.
Or do you think he hates
Can
it?
he pretend that he drives them too? Or maybe he does. I don't know.
You'd think you'd have to, right?
I
can't imagine you're like
if
in
you have
front
to
of this
get
like
it going really fast, maybe you have a driver who does that for
yeah.
you.
You probably have to be like you probably do have to sit and like be in there in the car and recording.
See, that's cool. You pretend that you drive if you don't, and then you're like, yeah, I love speeding up cars really fast. Baby.
No, I would think it was really cool if I met someone who did this job. I'm just imagining it's like, oh, like like your spouse like works in corporate HR.
I feel like corporate HR people are really into cars though. Surprise, like
Okay.
a lot of the time.
Fair enough. But you have to be like, well, I gather really specific sounds for a video game. And that's my job.
Yeah. You know?
I think it's sick. To be clear, if you're listening and that's your job, that's cool. Talk to me about it at a cocktail party. But I imagine you sometimes also have trouble.
Well, anything else to say about sound before we wrap this up? Before we go,
It's
that was my
like a
car
ghost
coming to a
break.
stop. Yeah.
That was a haunted car. It's crazy that anything gets done in a game. It's crazy that that the games of the scope that we are afforded now can ever happen. How many audio cues do you think are in, I don't know, in Elden Ring, in Baldur's Gate, in whatever?
So
how
frickin'
big
many.
is that spreadsheet?
Yeah.
Nightmare.
And also, hey, games, you can do really cool things with directional and audio and stuff.
Yeah, there's a niche here to be filled. This could be you. You could be the sound studio. Ninja Theory's got a little bit a head start, but like there's still room.
I do think most games do some level of directional audio for what it's worth, because
I'm not saying nobody
it's
does
providing information,
right?
but
like,
just you could step it up a notch, you know.
other people make intense narrative games about middle-aged white guys, but like nobody does it like Naughty Dog.
There's a real power of introducing a character by having them speak like directly into one ear.
There's a real power by introducing the character by having them speak through your controller speaker, which is the peak of audio design.
Oh yeah, I love Chadley and Goofy.
Yeah, the only two.
Nomura is the only one doing this.
You could usurp him. He hasn't done that much of it. This could be you. Jump in. It's your chance. Listeners, do you have a favorite sound that you've ever heard in a video game? Do you have requests for things that you want Emma to make Foley sounds for next week?
Yeah, tell me.
She's trained.
I've taken one course in college, so I'm an expert. I did okay.
Are you now thinking about how many spreadsheets must go into any given video game? If you have thoughts about this or anything else we talked about this week, hit us up on social media. We are on Facebook, Blue Sky, Instagram, and YouTube at Talk This Podcast. You can also visit our website, www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can read all about the show, check out the games in the hat, and read our blog, featuring a bunch of stuff from Emma about, OPs and EDs from EDs?
Yes.
Is that what I mean?
That is what you mean.
Why can't I think of what the D stands for?
They don't really stand. I don't know why it's abbreviated like that, because EN doesn't really get it across.
Anyway, Emma's written about anime music, and we've also written about other things. That's kind of sound effect relevant. But most importantly, if you enjoy the show, you ought to subscribe. We're on Apple Podcasts, YouTube Podcasts, TuneIn, Spotify, Pandora Podcasts, online and on the app, Overcast, Pocket Casts, wherever you can find podcasts. Subscribe to Talk This so you never miss an episode on Sundays at noon Eastern.
Next week, we're talking about sin and punishment. And
just in general.
I
think I made that joke last week too, but it's still funny.
And Eternal Strands.
So get ready for that. And then in 2 weeks, it's 6 weeks in gaming. And Emma, you know what I've just realized that means?
What does that mean?
Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii!
Will that be out?
It's a week from this
Oh, yeah,
past
you're right.
Friday.
You're right. I keep forgetting they moved it up a week.
Either way, it would be out.
The demo's out.
The demo's out. No, I have to play Final Fantasy.
It's not it doesn't like start at the beginning. It's like the Infinite Wealth demo. So you're probably not getting a lot out of it.
Okay. God, I have to play Final Fantasy.
Yeah, Malin, you've got a week.
I know. Oh, I'm in trouble. Okay, so tune in these next couple weeks to hear about Sin and about piracy. But that's it for this week's show. Emma, give us a good sounding outro here.
This week I hope that you